Oi, Tudo Bem? This one is for my Brazilian viewers. But something is missing. I just. Hello there! Now it feels like a Curihistory opening. Welcome to another episode. Today we will look at another dynasty again, the House Braganza, with all its kings and emperors that ruled over Brazil before it became a republic. But first we will introduce, of course, the one that started it all, Queen Maria the Mad. Queen Maria was actually known as Maria the Pious when she was still Queen of Portugal. Among her titles was also Princess of Brazil, which at the time was still a colonial possession of the European kingdom. However, due to a very old alliance, the oldest alliance in the world in fact, Portugal became entangled with Napoleon Bonaparte. The French emperor took offense to the Portuguese ignoring his continental blockade that was supposed to cut off Britain from any supplies. So in 1807 he invaded with the full might of the French army, which was perhaps the strongest of the world at the time. Queen Maria wasted no time and rallied her court to boldly flee to Brazil and ditch her people. According to some stories, pretty much everyone in the ship's court lies and had their head completely shaved. When the courtiers arrived in Brazil, the Brazilian high society thought this was the new style in Europe and promptly shaved their heads as well to go with the fashion. Brazil was sparsely populated at the time and the majority of its inhabitants were African slaves and their descendants. On top of that, Queen Maria suffered from severe dementia and was known to be paranoid. Still, the court managed to establish proper accommodations in Rio de Janeiro. When Napoleon was ultimately defeated in 1815, Maria was too old and ill to return and her regent and heir, John the Clement, established the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil and the Algarve, with Maria as its first queen. Only 1 year later, John would follow her on the throne, as she passed away. However, he hardly had an easier time ruling this new kingdom. In Brazil, he faced constant revolts by liberals that wanted to rid the land of their absolute monarch, and in Europe, Portugal became a playground for foreign powers. Even John's own wife, Carlota Joaquina, only used her status as queen to meddle in Portuguese politics on the behalf of her native Spain. Affairs in Europe got so convoluted that John decided to return to Europe, leaving his son Pedro as regent of Brazil. However, not long after he arrived, he faced first a revolt by his own son Miguel, probably instigated by Queen Carlota Joaquina, and then his other son Pedro declared Brazil independent and founded the Empire of Brazil. While John eventually managed to quell the unrest that had plagued Portugal, he never managed to regain Brazil, which was the largest source of income for his country. His only hope was that his son Pedro, who was still heir to the united throne, would restore the kingdom after his death. And that death came sooner than he expected. In March 1826, after showing sudden gastrointestinal symptoms, he died. Modern forensic investigation led historians to detect that he was indeed assassinated by arsenic poison. Pedro briefly inherited the crown of Portugal, but had no interest in it, as he had grand plans for his Brazilian empire. So his Portuguese possessions went to Maria II, his own daughter. His ambitions were entirely in South America, where he would soon be called the Soldier King. Even during his reign, Brazil was plagued by secessionist movements and local revolts. But at first, Pedro crushed them all, one by one. However, even he slowly became entangled in the European affairs of Portugal, and like his father before him, they turned out to be his undoing. Miguel, the emperor's younger brother, had returned. He was denied the throne of Portugal by his father John, but Maria II was not able to withstand him. He usurped the throne and became king of Portugal. Pedro had to intervene on his daughter's behalf. The problem was that Pedro, after being initially well liked by the Brazilian establishment, had become increasingly unpopular, especially after he had become publicly known he had an extramarital affair. He knew that if he left Brazil in this state, it would fall into the hands of others. So he did the only thing he could and abdicated on his own terms, leaving his son Pedro II in charge. And honestly, Pedro II was a fine choice. The younger Pedro abhorred absolutist rules, he was a follower of liberalism and civil rights. But most of all, he had to rid Brazil of its darkest, most inhumane custom, the practice of slavery. A staunch abolitionist, Pedro II pushed his views despite the strong opposition of plantation owners. In the long run, this made him enemies that would end his reign. In the meantime, he had, however, turned Brazil into a center of learning in South America, greatly pushing science and schooling in the country. The emperor also led Brazil through several wars against their South American neighbors. And at all this time, he had never even once left Brazil. Only in 1871, 40 years after his reign began, he traveled outside Brazil after the sudden death of his daughter in Vienna. The years of taking care of Brazil had left a heavy toll on his health, but this vacation in Europe and North Africa briefly invigorated him. In the 1880s, he finally managed to start working on another issue of great importance to him: women's rights. But he was no longer the young man that could stubbornly push against all political opposition. He was old and weary, and his enemies had just waited for him to become weak. Despite the prophesied economic disruption that the abolition of slavery was supposed to cause never occurring, the plantation owners had gathered enough power to cause a coup d'etat against their emperor. Too old and ill to fight it, Pedro abdicated with the words, "If it is so, it will be my retirement. I have worked too hard and I am tired. I will go rest then." He was not even allowed to find his death in the country he spent his lifetime building. For the next decades, Pedro II and his legacy would be slandered. But over time, more and more people realized what a great statesman their last emperor was, and today he is even considered to be the greatest of all Brazilians. This concludes today's story. Brazil is a fascinating country with a rich history and culture. I hope I could spark your interest in it as well. As always, I want to thank my wonderful artist and you viewers. If you enjoy this content, please leave a like and a comment and subscribe if you have not done so yet. Until next time, bye! According to some stories, pretty much everyone on the ships caught lice and had their heads their head completely shaved. Had have their head completely, oh my god.